Hello class. In this video, I'm going to be covering a new topic, and I'm also going to be creating a demo sort of template for the final project pitch presentation. So if you go under schedule, this is under week 12. I'm going to talk about interaction 2 in this video. I'm actually going to save the functions lecture for next time. So for the interaction 2, we're going to go over some basic examples, and then I'm going to create a button that we're going to use to enable our final project presentation. So the final proposal is different from the final project, but it is its own sketch, and it's just going to be a very simple sketch with a few slides in it that will cover a few components of what you want to do for the final project. I'm also going to show some examples of past final projects, and I will upload a template of the sketch so that you can use that as a starting point. So I'm going to get started with interaction 2, and I'm also going to create a new project so that I can add in these examples into the project while I'm going over them. So I'm going to start as usual, opening up GitHub Desktop. So once I have MMP 210 open, I'm going to click Show in Finder so I can go to my files. I'm going to create a new project here. It doesn't really matter which project we use, so I'm going to just create a new folder and then copy and paste some stuff over from another project. So this will be my pitch or presentation. I'll call this presentation. And so I just need to copy the P5 and HTML and style. So I'll go to one of my recent sketches just to make sure everything is up to date, and I'll copy the index. So I'll just do Command copy and paste, and I'll get the P5 library. I'm not going to get the sound library for this one, but if you want to add sound to your presentation, that's something that you could do. And finally, I'm just going to get the style, and I'm going to add that as well. So I'll make the sketch.js once we open that up. So I'm just going to leave this as it is, and then in my MMP 210 repo, you can see I've added some new files here, so that menu over here has gone away, but I can just go to repository and go to open in Sublime Text. And so that'll open up in Sublime Text. So as usual, I'm going to add a link to my index page to start. So here's my MMP 210 folder. Just going to scroll down. Here's the index.html. So that's my main projects page. And so this is the last bit of work that we're going to do. So I'm going to add in a link to the pitch here. So I'll add in my list item. And my folder name is presentation, so that's the link that this will go to. And then I'll just say this is the final project pitch. So it's basically just a short pitch to explain what you want to do for the final project. So it shouldn't take too long to work on this, but it's a good opportunity to use P5 in a different context. So I'm going to save that and close index.html. And then I'll go to presentation, open up index.html there, and just change the title here. So I'll zoom in a bit, and you call this my final project pitch, and I'll put that in the H1 as well. And I'm going to remove the sound library because if I don't have that there, it's going to cause an error. If you do want to use sound, feel free to add some sound in here, but I'm going to remove that for now. So I'm just going to save, and then I'll make a new file, and I'm going to save this as sketch.js. And I'll just put something in here to start. So I'll just say this is my final project pitch, and for me this is I'm making kind of a template for you guys to use, and I'll put the date, so it's May 4th. And so normally I'm going to start with setup and draw. For now, I'm just going to leave those, and we'll look at some of the examples, and then we'll come back. So I'm gonna save this and then go to Tools and go to Sublime Server, start the Sublime Server. And so now when I go to my browser and I click a new tab, go to localhost 8080. So then I'll just click on MMP 210 and click on Final Project Pitch. And so we don't have anything there yet, but we're gonna add some stuff in here. I'll just open up the console so I'm ready to start developing when I get back here. And so now let's look at a couple examples and then we'll come back to our Final Project Pitch. So in this lecture on interaction, we're going to be looking at a new way of interacting with a sketch. So in past examples, we've used environment variables and events like mouse X and mouse Y and mouse pressed. And today what we'll do is look at how do we interact with actual parts of the canvas or shapes on the canvas. So instead of just saying click anywhere on the canvas to have something happen, we'll actually be able to create a certain area. And so this is obviously a very foundational, sort of important concept in programming because it's the thing that allows us to make buttons. It's the thing that allows video games to work when you have characters running into each other or jumping on platforms or other things like that. Basically, being able to determine if two things are in the same place at the same time. So we've seen ways of doing this with default HTML elements like the buttons and the inputs, but today we're actually going to create our own version of those. So they're going to be a little bit simpler, but we're going to see how they work. And the code that we're going to write today is actually how your computer is running code whenever you click on a button or click on a tab or anything like that. It's going to be basically using the same code that we'll be looking at today. So this is sometimes referred to as collision or collision detection. So if you play video games, you may have heard of collisions or seen a video about collisions or something like that. This is how the computer knows if two things are in the same space. So we refer to that as a collision. So we're going to start with something simple, which is just the mouse, whether or not the mouse is in the same space as an object or a shape. To start, we'll use a circle. So a circle is a very simple shape, and so it's much easier to detect if we're inside of a circle than any other type of shape. So we'll use that as our first example, and then we'll continue from there. So to do a circle collision, we're going to use a function that we haven't seen before, which is the distance function. So if we click on here, you can see the P5 reference, and you can see in this example, there's two dots. One is moving with the mouse. Let me zoom in on that a little bit. So you can see one dot is fixed and one dot moves with the mouse X and mouse Y, and that number between the two dots represents the distance between the two. So here's like 50 pixels. As I move to the right, that number gets larger and larger and larger. So if you've been in a math or geometry class recently, you probably recognize that the way that you would make this calculation is using the Pythagorean theorem, a squared times b squared equals c squared. We don't really want to spend a lot of time doing that, and so conveniently P5 has created a function that does it for us. All we have to do is give P5 the 2 points that we want to calculate the distance, and it will do the Pythagorean theorem for us and calculate that distance. And so we can use that as a way of determining whether or not our mouse is inside of a particular area. So I'm going to close this reference. And so let's look at that code. So here we see the distance between the point 100, 100, which is in the middle of the screen right here, and then the mouse. And so we see the same visualization that we saw previously, but we can see whether or not that distance is inside of a circle. So this circle has the width of 100. And so if the distance between the center of the circle and the outside of the circle, if that mouse is less than that distance, then we see it turns yellow, meaning that we are in fact inside of the circle versus outside of the circle. So you've probably seen when you have a button and you can hover over it, the color will change. That's essentially what's happening here. And then to create an interaction, we just ask if we're inside of the circle, and then if we are and we're clicking, then whatever we want to happen with that interaction will occur. So let's keep going and look at how to implement this in a sketch. Here's a little example. I'm going to implement this in code as well. So you can see the circle and the rest of the sketch, and if I click, the circle will change color. But if I click outside of the circle, notice there is no color change. So I'm going to add this into a sketch just to kind of talk through what the code is, and then we'll continue with the notes. So I'm going to go back to my presentation sketch. I'm just going to put this in for now. It's not going to stay here. I'm going to start with my function setup as usual. For my presentation, I'm actually going to make my slides a little bit bigger so there's a little more space to work with. So I'm going to say create canvas, and usually we do 640 by 360, so let's make this a little bigger. Let's do 960 by 720. We can always change that later if we want to. So then in our function draw, we just want to know if we're clicking inside of a circle. So we can just draw a circle, and then we'll change the fill based on whether or not the mouse is inside. Okay, so I'm just going to draw the ellipse first. So I'll draw an ellipse. I'll put it in the middle of the circle. So I'll say width over 2, height over 2. And I'll make it sort of big. So I'll do 200 pixels. And so let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so we see our circle there in the middle of our project. Let's add a background in here just so we can kind of see what we're looking at with the canvas. Okay, so we have a bigger canvas for our presentation. We have our circle in the middle. And so our circle has an origin point right there. That's width over 2, height over 2, which is half of 960 and half of 720. And then it has a width of 200 pixels, which is 200 pixels from here to here. And so if we want to know if we're inside of the circle, we just divide that by 2, because the circle, the distance between the origin or center of the circle and the outside of the circle is half of the width. It's also referred to as the radius. So if our mouse is at any point less than 100 from the origin here, then we know that it's inside of this circle. So let's figure that out. So first we need to calculate the distance. So I'm going to say variable d for distance, and I'll just put a comment here, calculate the distance. So d for distance, so we'll use the distance function, which is shortened to dist, and we just give it 2 points, the point of the origin of the ellipse and the point where our mouse x, mouse y is. And this is a good time to use variables like x and y, because it simplifies. Instead of having to write a number over and over again, I can just use these numbers. So the origin of my circle is width over 2, height over 2, and the mouse position is mouse x and mouse y. And so then we're going to compare that to the size. So that's another point where it'd be good to use a variable so that we can change the size. So the hard-coded version would be if d is less than 100, so half of 200. If d is less than 100, let's change the fill to gold, so it'll be highlighted. Else, if it's not less than 100, then we'll do a fill of light blue, so it will have a different color. So now when we reload the sketch, if my mouse is inside of the circle, it's gold. If it's outside of the circle, it's light blue. So we can use that basic distance with a circle. It's pretty simple to calculate if it's halfway, if it's half the width of the circle. And then we can tell if our user is inside or colliding with that particular part of our sketch. So a good reason to use a variable here, let's say I change the distance down here to 300, or the width. Now it's not going to work. So it's still light blue, and then we get to the gold somewhere around here. So if these don't align, then we're not going to see the right result. So let's use the size variable. Okay, so if I set the size variable to 300, now I can draw my ellipse at the size, and then I can just divide size by 2 to get the distance of the radius. So now my interaction will work regardless of how big the size is, if I make it smaller or if I make it very large. So that's a good reason to use a variable here so that we can repeat that data both when we're doing the interaction as well as when we're drawing our circle. So this is a good example of when your visual cue to the user matches what's actually happening in the code. So we're doing this calculation, but if the visual expression of that calculation doesn't match, then the user will think that our code is broken. So we're gonna stop with our circle button for now, and we're gonna move on to creating a rectangle button, which is a little bit more complicated because the distance of a point between the center of the rectangle is always gonna be different. So we're gonna get rid of this code for now. I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that code. But we'll move on to creating a rectangle button. And we'll actually use 2 rectangle buttons to create the buttons for our final presentation. So with our rectangle button, rather than detecting the distance between the origin and the mouse, which we can see would not really work if our origin is here, this distance is much smaller than this distance, which is also different from this distance, etc. So we can't use one distance with a rectangle. Instead, what we have to do is we have to make sure that the mouse satisfies 4 separate conditions. So we're gonna have to use a compound conditional statement for this to work, but usually it looks pretty much the same. So it's not that easy, it's not that hard to recreate. So one condition is that the mouse X value has to be greater than the left side. One condition is that the mouse X value has to be greater than the left side of the rectangle. So here's my mouse X. If that value is less than this 100, the left side of the rectangle, you can see that the mouse is not inside of the rectangle. But if we go over, now we're inside of the rectangle. So that's just one condition. And essentially we have 4 conditions for each side of the rectangle. So mouse Y has to be greater than this 100 here. So in this case, mouse Y is less than 100, then we're not over the rectangle. As soon as we cross over 100, now we're inside the rectangle. So then we go to the other side. So mouse X has to be less than 300. So if we're greater than 300, we're over here. We're not inside the rectangle. If we're less than 300, then we're inside this part of the rectangle, which is really the left side of the rectangle plus the width of the rectangle, which I'll go over when we're writing the code. And then the last condition is just the Y down here. So the Y value has to be less than the starting position, 100, plus the height of the rectangle, which is also 100. So if all 4 of those conditions are true, then we know that the mouse is inside of the rectangle, and so we can then turn that rectangle into a button or some other type of interaction. So in this example, we can see that when we click on this rectangle, it changes the colors. If we don't click on the rectangle, the color doesn't change. So we'll use this as the basis for one of our buttons. And you can see that I'm using the X, Y, width, and height variables for the button because that makes it a lot easier to both display the rectangle and detect the collision without having to change the code a lot. So let's recreate this example. I'm not going to use the color. I'm just going to recreate the example to create a button, which we'll use to change slides. So let's go back to our project pitch. And I'm just going to put a button in the lower right-hand corner. So I'm going to make some variables first. And I'll use a little bit more specific variables in my code here than I did in the example because I'm going to have 2 buttons. So I'm going to need 2 sets of variables. So we'll start with a button that advances the slide. And so we also need a variable that we can track the slide with. So I'm just going to create a variable for that. So I'm going to say variable current slide. And that's just going to be a number. And so kind of like we did with our interactive memes, depending on what that number is, we'll display different information. So the current slide will be 0. So then for my first button, I'll create some variables. So this will be the next slide button. And so I'm going to use kind of long variable names here just so they're very specific. But in the demo I'm going to do for Thursday, we'll look at a much simpler way to do this using custom functions. But for now, I'm just going to use a bunch of variables. So I'm going to say variable next button X, and we can put that kind of somewhere sort of in the bottom right. So we'll give it maybe 800 on the X, and then variable next button Y. So maybe we'll say somewhere around 600. We can always adjust these later. And then we need a width and height for our button. So the next button width, W, we'll do 100. And the next button, H for height, we'll set that to maybe, let's try 33. So it'll be like a third of the width. So we'll set those up as our variables, and then we'll advance the slide using our button. So we have to draw the button, but then we also have to detect if the user is clicking on the button. So let's draw the button first. So I'm going to say this is our next slide button. And I'm just going to use a rectangle. So I'm going to say rectangle, next button X, next button Y, and next button W, and next button H. So just the X, Y, width, and height. And if we want to do a fill, we can do a fill as well. So I'll just say blue for the fill. So let's take a look at that. So there's our button down there. We could change the stroke as well if we want. Maybe I'll do a stroke as white. So that looks a little bit better. Maybe I'll increase the stroke weight a bit so it has a nice little outline. So that kind of looks like a button. You could also do rounded corners, you know, something like that, make it look a little more button-like. Of course, with the rounded corners, when I click on it, then it's, you know, there could be this like very small area here where it misses that click, but that probably won't be a huge issue. So let's move the button down a little bit, just so it's not taking up so much space. There's a lot of kind of like blank space down here. So I'll move it over a bit and down a bit. So I'll go to maybe 700 on Y. That's a little too far, so let's try 680. Okay, that's pretty good. And then let's try maybe 9, or actually we can just go with 880 on the X. That's a little too far. 860, 850. Okay, so that's pretty good. We can also draw some text there. So I can put some text down here as well and say next, and I'll just draw it at next button X, next button Y. So we have two different ways of visualizing this. Let's change the fill for our text to white, so it's more visible. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Text size is, say it's 25. And then we need to, actually, let's also get rid of the stroke because that doesn't really work that well on the text. And then let's just place it sort of in the middle of the button. So an easy way to do that is to say text align, and we can do center, comma, center. And then we can just move it over based on the button, or we could say, you know, we could add the button width as our text box. So we can say next button W and next button H. So now it'll actually fit inside of that text box as well. And so that'll actually place it right in the middle. So we can use the text align center center and the width and height of the button. And so that creates a nice little next button. And so we can do a couple things to determine if we are hovering over the button. And if we click on the button, we can change the slide number. So for now, I'm just going to show the slide number. We'll add some actual slides later, but just as an example, I'm just going to display the slide number. So I'm just going to put some text up here and say current slide. Let's put it at 100, 100. And I'll put a little label on it so it's not just a number. So I'll say slide plus current slide. And so we can see this is slide 0. And if we click this button, then we'll want to go to slide number 1. We could also start with slides starting at 1 if we want, but might be a little easier math-wise if we start at 0. So that's our first button. So we want to visualize the button, and then we also need to add the functionality to it. Right now, if I click on the button, nothing happens. So to add the functionality, we're going to add a mouse pressed event, which will only occur when we click on the button. We'll determine to make sure that we're inside the button when we do the click. So let's go back to our example and let's do function mouse pressed. And so what we have to do first is determine, are we inside of this button? And then if we are, then we'll just advance our slide. So here's where we're going to calculate if we're inside of the button. And so remember, we have 4 different conditions that we have to meet. So let's go back and look at those 4 conditions. So we need to make sure that the x is not less than 100, not less than the button x here, and not less than the button y up here. But we also need to make sure it's not greater than the button x plus the button width. So that's what we see here, is this is the x starting value and then the width of the button. So we add those together. And then same thing with the y. We start with the y and then we add the height of the button there. So we have to check all 4 of those. And so we're going to have 4 different conditions inside of one if statement. So we're going to start with if, and let's just start with the first condition. So we're going to say if mouse x, and so we need to be greater than the x position of the button. So I'm just going to copy that in there, next button x. So if that's true, then we know that the mouse x is at least to the right of the inside of the button. So then we need all 4 conditions to be true. So to add them together, I use a compound conditional statement. So the double ampersand means that both conditions need to be true. And as we keep going, we'll just add them up. So then the next part is mouse x is less than next button x plus next button width. And so what that will tell us is, if we look at our button, so the next button x is right here. So our mouse has to be greater than this number, so somewhere in here. And it also has to be less than, so if we go past this edge, then it's not inside the button anymore. So that's our x value plus our width of our button. So we have to be greater than this line and less than this line. And the good thing about using variables here is we can really easily move the button by changing these numbers, but our code will stay the same. So then I'm going to add another condition and do the y. And I'm going to go to the next line. So in JavaScript, it doesn't really care if I add line breaks here. So to make it easier to read, I'm just going to skip to the next line here. So this line is going to look really similar to the first line, except we're using y instead of x. So mouse y has to be greater than next button y. And mouse y has to be less than next button y plus next button h for the height. Okay, so those are my 4 conditions. So it's a bit complicated, but it's always going to look like this. So 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 conditions. If all 4 of those are true, then we know we're inside the button. And so we'll advance the slide. So we'll say current slide plus plus. So we'll add 1 to the value of the current slide, and then we'll add a check for this in a second so that we don't go over the number of slides, but for now we'll just increase the slide number. So if I click next, I'll just keep going, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now we can see where the button is, but we can also see if I click anywhere else on the canvas, nothing happens. If I click next, the slide advances. So that's how we can create our button using those button collisions. So let's look at one more example in the class notes, and then we'll finish our button. So we can also use buttons to do other things. So in this example, this button just adds ellipses to the screen. So it just draws an ellipse in a random place. So that's kind of what we're doing with our slide number. It's important to realize that with a button, besides just updating the button itself by changing the color or something like that, we can also update the anything else in our code that we want to update. So we're almost done. We're just going to add our next button, and then we'll have to add a couple things to make our presentation work. So let's add our previous slide button, and it's actually going to look very similar in some ways to our next slide button. So I'm going to say previous slide button, and so the previous button, I'm going to use prev, P-R-E-V as a shortcut there. So the previous button X. So we'll just put that, we'll try to guess how far this is. This is about 10 pixels. So it's going to be on the left side. So we'll just say 10 for X. And prev button Y, we'll use the same value as the next button Y. So I'll just put in next button Y here, so I don't have to change that. And then the width and height for my previous button are also going to be the same. So I'll just say prev button width equals next button width, and prev button height equals next button height. So you might ask, why don't I just use those numbers or make a different variable that's just like next button or something like that? We might want to make some different changes as we go, so I'm just going to add those variables in there. But it is nice to kind of make the buttons look the same, so there's really only one difference, which is the X position of that button. But if we decided to change other factors later, we would need to do that. So let's draw our previous button, but we're going to be reusing a lot of this stuff, like the fill, the stroke weight. So rather than copying and pasting this whole block, what I'm going to do is just use the display of the button. So instead of this being the next slide button, we're just going to say slide buttons here. And when I do the display for my button background, okay, so that's kind of what this is. This is the button background design. Then this rectangle now becomes the next button. And that's pretty obvious because obviously all of the variables we're using have the word next in them. So that should be easy to see. And so our previous button, I'll just copy this and paste it down here, and I'll just change every instance of next to previous. So that way we can draw both of our buttons without having to repeat our fill, stroke, and stroke weight. So let's take a look at that. So we see the button over here. Obviously it doesn't work yet, but it does have the right display. So let's add in the text. So this part is the text design, and all we're going to do down here is we have the text next. Okay, so it's pretty obvious what that does. I'm not going to bother putting a comment there. I'm just going to put previous here, and then since these are all the same values, I'm just going to copy that and paste it down here. So that's pretty simple. I'm going to leave this as a template for you guys, so you don't have to bother writing all this stuff out, but just want to go over what's happening here. So our previous is a little off. Let's see why that is. So I think the issue is that our previous button has some more text. So maybe if we add in, so yeah, our previous button is a bit wider than the next button. So let's just increase the width a little bit. So we'll just add in a few pixels. Okay, that's a little better. Maybe we'll add in 20 pixels. And maybe add in 30 pixels. Okay, so we can kind of make up the difference for the previous button that way. So now we have our previous button and our next button. So our previous button width is a little bit larger than the next button width. So it's nice to be able to change that variable. And so now we need to add in the actual functionality for the previous button. So let's scroll back down. So here's our mouse pressed. We're obviously detecting mouse collision with the next button here, and we need to do the exact same thing with our previous button. So detect mouse collision with previous button. So same thing, we start with an if statement, and if all four of these conditions are going to be true, then we're going to do the opposite thing with our current slide. We're going to say current slide minus minus. So let's go over those conditions again. So first of all, the mouse has to be less than this number. So that's the previous button X. So mouse X has to be, sorry, greater than. So if it's greater than whatever this number is, that means it's to the right of this line. So it might be inside the previous button. So it's greater than prev button X, and it's greater than it's less than x plus width. So once we get over to here, we actually need to make sure it's less than that value. So mouse x is less than prev button x plus prev button width. So then we go on to our y values, and these look just like the x values, but with y. Mouse y is greater than prev button y, and mouse y is less than prev button y plus prev button height h. Okay, so now we should be able to increase the slide and decrease the slide. Okay, so we have our two working buttons and we have some nice variables, so we can make some really easy changes. For example, if I wanted to put my buttons at the top of the page rather than the bottom, I could just easily change this y value to 10, and now they're both up there, but since I'm using buttons, they still work since I'm using those variables. Okay, so I could also change the x values. So maybe I want my previous button to actually be next to my next button. So I could use the same x value. So I could say next button x, and then I could either subtract or add on the y. So I could say y minus 100. So, you know, maybe that would be 50 or something like that, but I could put the buttons next to each other as well as in different places. So there's a lot of different options that I can move the buttons around, and I don't have to think too much about the code once I get this set up. Because I'm using variables, everything will update along with the variables. So displaying the buttons as well as detecting my mouse press. So I'm going to just change that comment. Okay, so now we need to actually add in our slides, and we can go over a little bit the requirements for the final project. So let's take a look at those. So for the final proposal, I basically want to see a few different things. One is what type of project you want to make. So you can choose one of our previous projects to kind of elaborate on. So you might do something with the self-portrait, but you could add to it. You might do something with the meme, but adding to it. You could do something with our pattern generator. You could also do something with a sound sampler. I'm going to introduce some new code in the next video this week to make a sampler using the mouse, so that might be more interesting. You could keep working with that, or you can propose, you know, something completely different that you make up. So whatever it is that you want to propose, the main things that we need to know are what's happening in the sketch, how the user will interact with the sketch, and what type of graphics will be used in the sketch. So that's everything we need to do for the proposal. For the final project itself, there's some more requirements as far as like using an external file, using variables, using logic, etc. But those aren't the kind of things that you need to include in the proposal. For the proposal, you can just say what it is that you want to make. So for an example, I'm going to say that I want to make a self-portrait that is also a sound sampler. So it's a self-portrait, but anything you click on will make a sound. So I'm just using that as kind of my default idea for my final project. And so I'm going to make some slides based on that idea. So for each slide, I want to have some text, and I also want to have like kind of an image or something like that. And so to do that, I'm going to use some different logic statements to show what I'm talking about for each slide. So instead of just displaying the slide number like I was previously, I'm going to use an if statement to determine what slide I'm on, and then I'll draw different things based on that slide. So I'm going to say if slide, or if the current slide, and then I'll say if it equals 0, then I'll draw some different text. And so I'm going to start with just the title for each one. And so there's a couple of different ways I can go about this. I can have like a variable for the sort of slide title, and then I can fill it in later. Or I can just like do all the styling and stuff in each slide. So again, on Thursday, I'll show kind of like better ways to do things like this using functions. But for now, I'm just going to try to use a variable. So I'm going to have like the title of the slide, and I'm going to start out just by declaring it. So I'm just going to say, you know, there's a title for each slide, the title of the slide. So if the current slide is 0, then the title will be my final project. So just really simple, just saying what it is. And so then we'll go to the next one. So else if the current slide equals 1, then I'll talk about the user interaction. So I'll say the title equals user interaction. And then for the last slide, I'll say if the current slide equals 2, I'll say the title is graphics. So I'll show an example of the graphics that I want to use. And I think that covers everything. If you want to add more slides, you're welcome to do that. You'll have to update your code a little bit. So then I'm just going to display the title. So that way, instead of having to write all the display code that I would do for the title, like the fill and stroke and stuff like that, I'm just going to do it all at once right here using the title variable. So for the title, I want a bigger text. So I'll say the text size is like 100. And then depending on where you want, you can do different designs. So one thing that I might do is put the text on the left. So I'll show an example of that. So let's say the fill is white and there's no stroke. And I'm going to say the text is the title. And for this one, I'll just put it at 10x and 10y. And I won't change the alignment. So we should see that title. Oh, actually, I changed the alignment later. So let's say text align is left and top. And so we get my final project. So that's like a left aligned version. That's a little bit easier because I don't really need to know the width or anything like that. It is a little large, so I might make this a bit smaller. So my final project, and I could maybe increase the spacing here. So that's one way I could design it. If I wanted to center it, if I use text align center center, now my text is going to be kind of offset. So I need to move it into the middle of the screen. So I can say width over 2. So that'll get me to the middle. And then I'll move down a little bit on the Y, maybe like 100. So now we have a centered version of the title. So I kind of liked the previous version. So I'm going to go back to that real quick. Okay, so my final project. So we have the final project, and if we have our code right, as I go to the next screen, we should see our titles. Okay, so we have my final project, user interaction, and graphics. And then if I keep going, then the slide number actually goes past the number of slides we have. So let's fix that really quickly. We're gonna use some more logic to fix that. So we have this current slide, and then we have the number of slides that we need. So we really only have 3 slides. We have 0, 1, and 2. So you might have more slides. You can increase this number if you want. But the number of slides that I have, number slides, or let's say number of slides is 3. And so we'll just check to make sure that the current slide is, if we want to go up, the current slide has to be less than the number of slides. If we want to go down, then it has to be greater than 0. So that's just another if statement I can put inside my mouse pressed. So we're only going to increase the number of slides if, or let's put this on a new line, if the current slide is less than the number of slides, then we'll say current slide plus plus. So this will prevent it from going over. So we go 0, my final project, user interaction, graphics, and then, oh, actually we go, we're gonna have to say if the current slide is less than number of slides minus 1, since we're starting to count at 0. So my final project, user interaction, and then it stops working at graphics. So then if we want to prevent our slides from going below 0, we can just say if current slide is greater than 0, then when we click previous, we'll do current slide minus minus. So that way we'll check to make sure the current slide is greater than 0 so that we can do previous. So now I can go next, 1, 2, 3, previous 1, 2, 3, and it stops. So a lot of time we have to use a little bit of extra logic to make sure that our slides work. And if we want to be really fancy, we can use if statements to actually show these buttons. So we could only show the next button when there are next slides. And I can use the exact same logic here. So here's our next button. So we only need to display the next button if the current slide is less than the number of slides minus 1. So if current slide is less than number of slides minus 1, then we'll show that text. And so what we'll see now when I refresh is if I go to the last slide, then it disappears. But I guess we also need to do that with our rectangle. So let's add this up here. So this is kind of going a little bit fancier than we necessarily need, but just to kind of cover how we can use the same logic in multiple places. So then let's do that with our previous slide as well. So if the current slide is greater than 0, we'll show the previous. So I'll move that in there. And same thing up here. So we're only going to display these slides if they're actually able to be used. Sorry, these buttons. Okay, so next, and then that goes away, previous, and then that goes away. So that's kind of how our slideshow works. That way we can prevent the user from going too far into the slides. And then if you want to add more slides, just increase the number of slides here and add more slides into your if statement here. So I'm going to say set up each slide. So besides the title, I'm going to have a description for each slide. So I'm going to say variable description. And so this is going to be describing what happens at each part of the project. So for the final project, I'm just going to do a general overview of what the project is about. So I'm going to say an interactive self-portrait that plays sound effects when the user clicks on each part. So that's just something I just came up with as an example. You can obviously fill in whatever your example is going to be. So that's the description for the first slide. For the second slide, I'm going to add a new description. And so this is going to be kind of similar to the part where I described the user interaction up there. But I'm just going to elaborate a little bit. And I'm going to move these else if statements down so it's just a little easier to read this way. This is actually not really great coding syntax, but it just makes it a little easier to read. So for this description, I'm going to say this is what happens when the user, this is when I want to describe the user interaction. So I'm going to say user will click different parts of the self-portrait to trigger sound effects. So it's pretty similar to the first description, but you might have more going on in your final project, so you could include that there. And then finally, for the last one, for the description of the graphics, this I'm actually going to use an image to kind of give a little bit more information there. But for the description, I'm just going to say the graphics will use P5 shapes and colors. So you can just describe whether you're using the P5 like rectangle and ellipse and stuff like that, or if you want to use images, you could also look into other graphics that you could use if you're interested in, but those are the two main ones that we've done. I guess you could also include if you're going to use text in that. So after I display the title, I'm then going to display the description. So I'm going to make a smaller text size. So maybe I'll say like 40. And I'll use the same fill, so I don't have to update the fill or the stroke. I'll use the same text align. So I can leave all of those the same as long as I'm not changing them. So then my text will be the description. I'll use the same X, but I need to move farther down on the Y. So I'll try 100, and then I'll update it if I need to. So I definitely need to move it down a bit further. So I'll do 200. And then we can see that we're going off the edge of the screen here. So let's add a width to constrain it a little bit. So I'll just take the width of the canvas and then I'll subtract 2 times this margin 20 to make sure that it fits. Okay, and that actually looks pretty good. So I'm not too worried about that. So I'll leave that the way it is. And then let's make sure our description updates. So my final project, an interactive self-portrait that plays sound effects when the user clicks on each part. And the user interaction, user will click different parts of the self-portrait to trigger sound effects. And then the graphics will use P5 shapes and colors. And so then I'm gonna use, I'm just gonna create a little graphic example here to kind of complete the slideshow. And then that'll be basically everything that I need to include. So for your own slideshow, you can have something pretty similar, but you might have like a few slides of graphics just to show different things that you want to do. So I'll go over adding graphics into our graphics slide, and then I'll also just cover adding another slide just in case you want to use more slides. So on the graphics page, we want to give an example of the type of graphics that we'll use. So those could be images, you could use drawings, and you could take pictures or scan them. Anything that you want to use for the graphics is totally fine. If you want to use something and you're not sure, just ask me and I can take a look. But I'm just going to add some simple graphics. So I'm just going to give an example of the self-portrait that would be used in the final project. So I'm just going to say graphics example. And then I can just, do the drawing directly right here inside of the slide. So anything that I draw inside of this if statement right here will only appear on that slide. So for my graphics example, I'm just going to do a self-portrait. I'm going to do this real quick. So I'm just going to say ellipse. I'll put it kind of in the bottom right down here. So I'll try to guess where that would be. Maybe like 600x and like 500y, and I'll make it 200 pixels wide. And so then I have to go over here to look at it. And one thing that you might want to do as you're developing the slides is I can actually change the current slide value over here. So if I'm working on slide 2, I can set that to slide 2, and now it'll load directly there. So I can edit this and then I can change that later before I upload it. So here's the self-portrait. I'll just draw an ellipse and then I'll draw some eyes. So for the eyes, maybe I'll use a rectangle just to try something different. So I'll try a rectangle at 550 and y is maybe 400 and the size is maybe 50. We'll see what that looks like. And we can't see it, I don't think. So let's just put a stroke on this. Let's just make it black. Okay. Oh, I forgot to add the height of the rectangle. Okay, so that's one eye. And the next eye, let's just move it over a bit and do everything else the same. So obviously I didn't really spend a ton of time on this, but I just want to give a quick example of what your graphics might look like. Let's move these down just a bit. Okay, so there's like my self-portrait, and I could kind of go from there. But just to give a quick example, you can draw whatever graphics you want into the slide. If I wanted to add another slide, I would just change the number of slides. So let's put that back at 0, and let's change the number of slides to 4. And so we have 0 is 1, 1 is 2, 2 is 3, and then we go to else if current slide equals 3. So this would be our 4th slide since we started counting at 0. And so I can just copy and paste, or I can keep writing right here. So I can say title equals, maybe this is graphics part 2, and description is maybe I'll say here's like my background design. And so maybe for the background design, I'm going to use one of the grid things that we did. So I could just do a quick grid. So here's my graphics part 2. I'm going to set the current slide to 3 so that I can see that. And then I'll just do a quick grid. So, maybe this would be in the background. Okay, so for the background design, I'll just do something simple, kind of like our nested for loop with pattern, but I don't want to do anything too complicated with randomness or anything like that, because we are doing the draw function. So I'll just say, let's just say for let x equals 0. So anything I could do in my other sketches, I can do in here just as well. And this is actually coming before the text, so we will see it behind the text. So x equals 0, x is less than width, x plus equals. I'll use a variable here, so I'll say var w equals 50. So we'll just say 50 pixels. Just gonna make a simple pattern. Oops, let's use w there, and I'll use the same for x and y. So for let y equals 0, y is less than height, y plus equals w. Just gonna use the same for width and height. So let's see, let's just draw a few shapes. I'll draw an ellipse. I'll say x, y, and then let's actually say w times 2. That might be kind of interesting to kind of overlap. Let's see, we can't actually really see anything, so let's say no fill here, and then let's say the stroke is black for now. We can change that later. So we got a bunch of circles. You can see they're kind of overlapping in interesting ways because we have so many of them, so that's kind of cool. So we can start with our ellipses. Maybe we'll add in a rectangle somewhere, so I'll say rect. Let's just see if I do x, y. If I just do WW, that's not going to be very interesting. It just kind of creates a square, but maybe if I say W over 2 or W over 2, and it's a little interesting, maybe not that interesting. But maybe if we kind of align it a little bit, so I'll say minus W over 4. Okay, so that's starting to fit into the pattern a little bit more. So there's a lot of other stuff we could add in there. Maybe I'll change the stroke. So I'll say the stroke for the ellipse is that, and then maybe the stroke for the rectangle is a different color. Whatever I want my sort of background design to be, that's actually a little too much. So let's say it's like 51 would be, oh, that matches the background. So let's try 127. Okay, so we can kind of play with some different stuff. That's kind of interesting. So you can really do a lot of different stuff with this. So yeah, you can just basically draw whatever you think the graphics will be. So if you want to add a slide, you can just increase that slide number, draw some more graphics, or do whatever else you need to do to explain your project, and that should be good. So there's the slides template. I'm going to kind of delete some of this content just so you can use this more as a template. So I'm just going to go through, I'm going to turn the current slide back to 0, so it starts at the beginning, turn the number of slides back to 3, and just delete this slide here. And then I'm just going to get rid of some of this stuff so that you guys don't have to rewrite it, and just fill in. So for the description, this is just a 1-sentence description of the project. So I'm just going to kind of fill in these blanks so you guys can do them yourself. So if you want to give the project a name, you can do it there. User interaction, describe how the user interacts with the sketch through the mouse and keyboard. And then for the graphics, just describe what type of graphics will be used, including P5 function, or let's say P5 shapes and colors, images, or other. You could also talk about if you want to use sound in here. Maybe that would be another slide that you could add if you're planning to use sound. So that's basically the template. I'll upload that obviously and include a link. You guys should feel free to change the font, change the colors, do other things to make it look more like your own project. So yeah, that's basically it for what we're going to be doing for this week. On Thursday, I'm going to do another video where I'll kind of look at using functions. So that's something that you might want to do for your final project. There's not an assignment, a specific assignment associated with that, but it kind of goes into the next version of the keyboard sampler, which we kind of ran out of time for. It's going to be a sound sampler using the buttons that we learned how to create today. So again, you can look at those notes and that project and use that for ideas, but it's not required to do a specific assignment with that. The last thing I'm going to do this video is just show a few examples from previous classes. So I'll do that now. I'm just going to upload this final project pitch real quick. So I'm going to go to the Google desktop. I'm going to say adds template for final project pitch presentation and commit that to master. So as usual, I'll include a link to that in the YouTube video. So you guys will see that, and I'm just going to close out GitHub. And so the last thing I'll do is I went through some old examples of class finals and projects, and so I just pulled a few that are kind of some good examples. These are a little bit different than the class has been a little bit different for the last couple of years because we had a physical computing section, which obviously we didn't have time to do this semester, or we didn't do this semester because of the distance learning. So this is actually going to be more similar to previous versions of the class. So I went back a couple semesters to look for some examples. So there's a lot of examples of stuff online, but I wanted to show some previous student projects just so you can get a sense of what some of the previous student projects look like. So here's one from, let's see, a couple semesters ago. This one actually did work with the physical computing, but the student added in a keyboard interaction as well. So the basic idea of this project was he used a humidity sensor, and if it got wet, it would blow out the candle. But he added, you can change the value of the keyboard. So you can see if I increase or decrease the value of the keyboard, the candle will light. And then if I increase it again, it'll blow out the candle. So he's using all P5 shapes for this. It's a pretty interesting graphic that he was able to get. And he used some transparency and some different effects to do the light and the fire. So that's a really nice project there. So you could do something like that with the keyboard or the mouse. So that's one project. Here's another project that is sort of an elaboration of the generated pattern that we did. So this student created a bunch of different icons for a Halloween theme and basically just generated different patterns. So taking a project that you've already done or that we did in a different example and then just elaborating on it. So making sure that everything looks really good, thinking about the color scheme and the use of shapes, and really working on the different elements of the design to kind of create this more final looking pattern. So this is a really nice project from a few years ago. Here's another project by the same student, which has some sound and animation happening as well. So this would be a good final project. So you can see one scene is the sort of daytime scene with some bird sounds. And then when I click, I get another scene. So some of the elements stay the same and some elements change. And you can see the student use a lot of nice effects with the P5 shapes. So there's different transparency layers to add shadow and curtains and different things like that. And then the soundtrack changes depending on which scene you're on. And then you can also see some subtle animations like the clouds in the background and the cat blinking. So it's another nice, just sort of simple interactive animation. This project is based on what we'll look at on Thursday, which is a sound sampler. So this project may not run super well because there's a lot of big files in here. So you can see that, yeah, some of these files are not loading. A lot of these projects are kind of old, so they may not be maintained, but you can still see the basic idea. So if we play the rectangle, we'll hear different background music. And then the shapes are different sounds. So that's a project using sound. I'm going to go over some stuff in the next video for this week that covers how you would make something like that. This project actually has some errors, so you can't see the whole thing, but it's a really nice project because it's basically like a sort of informational presentation on swimming. You can see there's this nice kind of animation in the background and images as well. And if I click, it goes to the next slide and we hear a sound in the background. So this student actually kind of just like kept working with the slides idea. But you can see there's an error here. So we can't see the rest of the presentation, but you can kind of see what the student's approach was. This project is more of kind of an abstract design that combines animation and sound as well. So there's basically two states, this green one and this pink one. And when I click, it changes states and it changes the rate of animation of the shapes in the screen. So it's kind of abstract, but it has kind of a nice effect, and you can kind of play with these different colors and move around. So that's another example of kind of like an abstract animation that you could do for the final project that includes sound and graphics. And one last example, this one is kind of a simple game. So if you're interested in games, you might want to do something like this. We haven't really covered everything that you would need for this, but we've covered a lot. And so in this game, I can basically catch these sodas to try to prevent them from polluting the water and hitting the fish. So it's a pretty simple game where basically I'm just doing a collision detection between the mouse and these falling objects. And so if you were interested in doing something like this, well, actually, I don't even have to click the mouse. I just have to move this on the sodas. So something like this looks very complicated, but you could actually do it with just a little bit more code than what we've done in class. The student was interested in creating it, so we worked to create the extra code to do this. So if you wanted to create a simple interactive game like this, that's another approach that you could take. So those are just a few different examples. I'll leave this here on the public pad if you're interested in checking these out, and I'll add them in the YouTube video as well. So if you have any questions about how you might create or implement one of those examples, you can feel free to ask me. And if you have other ideas, or you just want to work with one of your previous projects and sort of elaborate on it, that's a perfectly good approach as well. So that's it for this video. I will create another video on Thursday, as I mentioned, going over the interactive sound sampler. And so if you have any questions, just email me or chat me on Discord.